Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our 2025 winter lecture series. We're really happy to be able to be doing this again this year. Just give everyone something to think about in these muddy and cold times. Spring's right around the corner, but it's not quite here. So that's why we have this lecture series, just to hold everyone over until then. Today is our first of the winter lecture series, and we have Rebecca Long here, who is the coordinator of horticultural training programs at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension in Oxford County. And we are very pleased to have her here. And so without further ado, I will hand it off to Rebecca.
Cool. And just double check everybody on Zoom can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Thank you guys. Welcome everybody in the room and everybody on Zoom. I'm going to be like going back and forth. If for any of you who haven't met me, Rebecca Long, I work for University of Maine Cooperative Extension. If you guys aren't familiar with us, we are, got my clicker working. There we go. The outreach branch of the University of Maine. We have an office just over Olson Road off of 26 in South Paris. So today I'm going to be talking about garden design, installation, and maintenance, but specifically through an ecological lens. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some of my own successes and lessons learned. Not calling them failures, but lessons learned. So what comes to mind when you hear the term ecological garden design? Just shout out or type in the chat, word association. What do you think? Butterflies, native flowers. Bees. Cool, absolutely. I'm going to start with the definition of ecological. It is involving the interrelationships between living organisms and their environment. There wasn't any single good definition of ecological landscaping or garden design that I liked, but some of the general bullet points is that part of it is understanding the environmental consequences of plant choices and management procedures, ecosystem services, which is a way of saying what services or what does your landscape provide to the ecosystem. Is it pollinator habitat? Is it sequestering carbon? But also this is still a garden for you, so does it meet human needs? Does it meet your aesthetic goals? That's ecological. Does it minimize resource inputs, and is it in balance with the local climate? So I think a real key piece of this is that ecological garden design is place specific. It's part of the local environment. And a caveat before we get started, I have training in the ecological and the garden side of this. I don't have as much training in the design part. So there are probably people in this room who are better designers than I am. Maybe not core.
Sometimes, depends.
So it's mostly going to be the ecological perspective, but there is a little bit of design thrown in there. Hi. Okay, so starting with the garden design, the basic outline of it is that you're plotting your area, analyzing your area. Then once you have all that information, you can start brainstorming, doing a basic design, and then you get into a more detailed design. That's the broad outline. So I'm going to go through these steps with an ecological lens, and I'm going to give you guys some examples from my own process. So this is all going to be kind of through the lens of a project I did in my own garden. So plotting your area, you're creating a map of the area you plan to design for with what's currently there that you want to keep. So your infrastructure, your buildings, driveway, walkways, utilities, and any existing vegetation that you want to keep. So if there's trees you want to keep, garden beds, you want to include all that. There's a lot of different ways you can create maps. You can go from being super tech savvy to not at all. I personally like to print out a Google Earth view. You could do Google Earth or Google Maps. And then I got good old-fashioned tracing paper, put it over the top, and that's how I started my design. And that way I could just kind of sketch in and add shapes and add where I thought my fence was going to go. But I did eventually use Google Slides, which is similar to PowerPoint, which is actually kind of a decent design tool. It's free and pretty straightforward, but there are tons of apps out there and programs if you're really into design. But you can see after my initial kind of messing around phase, I did move on to that so I could actually start recording plants. Has anyone done a garden map, and did you use any other tools? How did you do yours?
I have graph paper,
Yeah.
and I, started with the hardscape and all that, and I just did one a few days ago. I'm trying to redo my herb garden, and I, put the plants I wanted to save, and I left areas, and then I just went through and looked at each plant and made sure it was gonna be a good neighbor for the next.
Yep. So for everybody on Zoom, we had a suggestion of graph paper, which is a great one, because then you can actually do scale, and like this shrub's going to take up 3 feet by 3 feet. You can use your graph paper to keep that in mind. It's a great suggestion. Part of this is going to be identifying your existing vegetation. Why? And we're talking about ecological garden design. We definitely want to know if you have any invasives so that you can plan for removing those, but also, do you have any natives already present that you might want to keep? Also, if you have trees, understanding their full size, especially important when landscaping right around houses. Sometimes you'll see trees and shrubs planted too close. And I think it's really important to identify everything before you start removing, because something you may assume is a weed could actually be a native with some value. I've heard it said, if you can't name it, why would you pull it? I listened to a webinar about a public garden, and they had a really good example that they actually discovered a fairly rare native, and had they not known, they might have just pulled it out because it looked kind of weedy. So a big plug for identifying it. How are you going to identify? There are apps out there. Seek and iNaturalist are two of them. I always tell people to use those with a grain of salt because it is technology doing the identifying for you, but I particularly like iNaturalist because it does an initial AI identification, but then it goes to other citizen scientists who confirm it. So once you get 2 or 3 other people confirming it, I start to feel more confident. If you're looking to identify invasives, the Maine Invasive Plant Field Guide is really good. It's like a nice flip book you can take with you. For native trees, Forest Trees of Maine, there's PDFs of this available for free online. So you don't have to buy this one, you can just pull up the PDFs. And it goes kind of by group and compares them. So here's all the different maples you might find in Maine and how you know maybe which one you have. So those are all resources that I use. And I think it's worth waiting a full season when you're doing this identification step, because first of all, the apps and you are both gonna have a lot easier time identifying things when they're in flower. And also some things don't even come out until, maybe summer or even fall. So you're giving yourself a full season to see what pops up. And I'm gonna give you a few examples of what, if I hadn't identified what was on my property, things I would have popped up and maybe not even realized. So I had tons of asters and natives, or asters and goldenrods. Didn't identify them down to species because that's kind of hard. I had jewelweed. Is everybody familiar with jewelweed? It can seem kind of weedy, but it is actually an amazing annual native. It fills in super quickly. So especially if you have some invasives you're removing or something, it helps fill in really quickly and shade it so you don't get other invasives coming up. Bees love it, and actually hummingbirds love it. This is the single thing I've seen the most hummingbirds at on my property. The second one is a Persicaria, so it's in that lady thumb family, and so because it looks like lady thumb, which is not native, I immediately was like, oh, this is something invasive. It's not. This is actually a native Persicaria. So that's an example of it looked kind of weedy. It's a vine that kind of seems a little aggressive, but it's native. But we'll see how aggressive it is before I decide if I'm keeping it. This is a native annual lobelia, has cute little lobelia flowers and lots of seeds. That just popped up, as did broadleaf enchanter's nightshade, which is a really cool woodland edge native. So these are all just things that popped up. They were either in the seed bank or they came in some bird poop or something. So if I was just weeding out anything I didn't recognize, I might have lost all of these. But I don't want to sound like I'm bragging about all my natives. I had invasives too. This is the list of all the invasives that I found on my property so far. So I've had pretty much everything. That's me saying next to that's all Japanese knotweed. And these are piles of not only bittersweet, but actually multiflora rose that had vined all the way up into these trees that we removed. I had bittersweet vines big enough to literally swing off of. So yeah, not showing off. I had plenty of invasives too, and I've identified all these and I'm working on removing them. Okay, so now that you've collected all the info about your property, the next is start analyzing it. And this is the information you're gonna need to make decisions later about your design and your plant choice. I'm not gonna go more in depth on all of these, but I will for a couple. But you definitely wanna do some soil testing and learning about your soil. Learn about local rules and codes, especially if you're gonna be putting in fencing or any structures. Your orientation, north, south, east, or west, we're gonna talk more about that, along with any sun shadow areas, water patterns, wet and dry areas, your topography, your slope, but also where you are in the broader landscape. Views you might want to keep or views you want to hide. Wild energies is a term I like, and it refers to like a neighbor's dog or busy traffic or, you know, just something that you might want to take into account. And then practical considerations, pedestrians, cars, so where are people going to walk, where do cars need to go. In Maine, we cannot forget snow removal, snow storage, and drop zones. So if you get your driveway plowed, where is all that snow going to go? You know, where's the snow going to drop off of your roof? Maybe you don't want some really delicate plants under that. And lastly, of course, plant hardiness zone. So we'll talk a little bit about soil testing. I'm sure you've heard someone, me probably before, talk about soil testing. The big difference about soil testing for ecological garden design as opposed to a vegetable is that in a vegetable garden, we're really trying to push production, so we're often adding a lot of amendments. But native plants are adapted to our soil conditions. So they are used to pretty acidic soil, so you can see here it's pretty low. So they're adapted to that. Think about our native wild blueberries. They grow in acid soil. And they're also adapted to more nutrient-poor soils. So these recommendations, these are for lawn in this case, we would ignore all of these. You probably wouldn't want to raise your pH if you're going to be planting natives, because that could actually favor turf or some weeds to outcompete the natives. Same with adding too much fertilizer, that can actually just help the weeds outcompete. So kind of the difference is, I think it's still worth soil testing, especially, you know, because they're going to look for things like lead. Still worth soil testing, but keep in mind we're not going to be amending nearly as aggressively. Talking about sun, shadows, and compass orientation, we mentioned beyond just shaded areas that trees are, you're also going to want to think about what side of a slope you're on. And remember, of course, that in the northern hemisphere, the southern side of a slope gets the sun more directly than the north. I can tell because I have a north-facing driveway. My neighbor has a south-facing driveway, and hers always melts way before mine, and I'm very jealous. But when you're gardening, you're gonna think about things like frost pockets and temperatures. So even in the same area, something that might be hardy and be over winter on someone's south-facing slope might not if you're on a north-facing slope. A tool I really like, there's this Lumos app. I think there's probably some other apps too that are sun trackers, but basically it shows you the sun's path for your location on any day you set it to. So the way I use this tool is, if I'm thinking about siting a new garden, yes, I could go stand out there all day and figure out how many hours of shade it gets. But with this app, I can just go out and I have a big tree, I hold up my phone and I'm like, okay, the sun's gonna be behind that tree for 3 hours. And the other nice thing is you can tell it what date. So I can go out there today and set the date of the app for the middle of the summer and learn where the sun's going to be at the time of year that it matters for plant growth, not right now. So I think this is a really good shortcut to try to figure out how much shade. And of course, that's critical for plant choice, because when we talk about right plant, right place, one of the things we're talking about is how much sun it needs. Keeping in mind that if a label says full sun, we're talking about 6+ hours. Partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, partial shade 2 to 4 hours, and anything that says shade is probably going to be getting less than 2 hours. So if you go out with your app and you realize that your next garden is only getting 2 or 3 hours a day of sun, probably should not be putting in full sun plants.
Did you say what the name of that app was and I missed it?
Yeah, it's Lumos, L-U-M-O-S. It's free, not an endorsement of any product specifically, but it's a free app. We're also gonna, for sure, wanna look at water patterns in wet and dry areas. And this is another one where if you can spend a whole season looking before you plant, it's pretty critical. An example of this is in the middle of the summer, this spot looks perfectly dry and nice. This is it in the winter. That's a different angle, but the exact same spot. And in reality, this is a pretty wet run in my yard. And when we were digging these fence posts, sure enough, 6 inches down, the hole's filled with water. So giving yourself a full year to observe the way water moves in your landscape can help, because by the time I put in this garden, I knew this. So everything that went in there are things that don't mind some water. It's things like willows, cardinal flower, other natives that don't mind being a little bit wet. Okay, so we've collected all your information that you're gonna need to make decisions. Now we get to brainstorm, which is really the fun part. Before you dive into it, I think it's important to think about all these things: your personal aesthetic style. What do you need for recreation? Do you want, do you play soccer in your yard? Do you have a dog that you want in your yard? Or do you just want to have some nice dinners? What do you need for storage, compost vehicles, privacy? Do you want space to grow vegetables, herbs, fruit, trees? But also, what does your ecosystem need? So as you're designing, can you think about ways to lower your inputs? And can you add habitat elements? And also, I think it's important to have an overarching goal or philosophy or approach, because there's so many decisions to make and so many plants out there. It can be really tempting to just start adding a lot of stuff. But if you have a goal to go back to, you can ask yourself, okay, does this meet the goal I set out when I started my design? So I'm going to tell you about what my personal approach is, just because I think it's important for you to know as we go forward in this that the decisions I'm talking about that I made were because of my personal approach. They may not fit your personal approach. I think when we talk about things like ecological gardening, sometimes it can come across a little pedantic, like you have to do it this way, this is the best way. It really depends on your personal goals. So I just want to be clear that my personal goals are what inform these decisions. Some of these might not be right for you, and that is totally fine. So things that were important for my approach: I really wanted to create wildlife habitat. I love watching birds and insects and pollinators. I wanted to be environmentally conscious in my choices, and I want my garden to be climate resilient. But I also have other motivations. I love collecting plants, so I wanted a way to put in a bunch of different plants. I like garden as recreation. That's really like how I like to get exercise. But I also am conscious of there's some kind of maintenance I don't like to do. So I'm going to design, I don't like mowing. So I'm going to design my garden so I have to do as little mowing as possible. I want it to be beautiful to suit my weird taste. I like black flowers. I like weird spiky flowers. And all the boring stuff like snow, compost, privacy. So I think an important step is finding your style inspiration. There's always books. There's also Instagram and Pinterest and YouTube. I want to give the caveat, though, that there's more and more AI stuff out there, especially on Pinterest. I've started to notice a lot of really suspicious pictures of gardens with too many things blooming all at the same time, and they're all really bright. So I think just take anything you see in social media with a grain of salt. I think that's why it's also really important to visit gardens, because harder to fake stuff in real life. So if you visit gardens, you see what things, like McLaughlin garden, you see what things look like growing, in a garden. I also want to plug, for if you're up for a field trip, Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Mass. is the Native Plant Trust's garden. It's like you're driving through a neighborhood, you're like, I don't know what this is going to be, but it's basically like coastal Maine botanical gardens, but for native plants. It's pretty amazing. And they sell plants there. But also I think for ecological gardening, it's important to observe plants in nature. If you observe what other plants are growing alongside, what conditions they're growing in, that can help you. Also finding specific designers you like. I like Piet Oudolf. He was, what do they call the movement? He's Dutch. I forget what they call his movement. It's like the New Naturalist or something. There's this documentary, 5 Seasons. If you want something really relaxing, you do have to pay to rent it. But it's basically a very quiet documentary with just shots of his garden. But his big thing is he designs surrealistic meadows. So they're highly designed and maintained, but he much more was trying to mimic nature. He also talks a lot about not just one season, but gardens having to look good all the time. So he thinks a lot about structure of like, is the structure of these plants going to look like in the winter? And he also says, brown's a color. So he's thinking of like, in the winter, how can we have different shades of browns? And so I think it's really cool that he's finding beauty in all of that. And he talks a lot of beauty and decay and gets a little philosophical. But so finding a designer you like can help. And once you're brainstorming, you're going to start actually writing down your design. There's bubble design is your sort of more brainstormy phase where you're just kind of broadly saying, I think I might add in a rain garden here because it's wet and I have room for my veggies here because it gets full sun. Your detailed design is when you're really starting to put in more exact, there's going to be a tree here and a shrub here. I will say though, from my experience, what's a lot more practical for your detailed design is to do it in stages. I think it's pretty unrealistic to be able to do a complete detailed design of your entire property at once. I don't think most people could afford to install or have the energy to install that much at once. So I guess I just want to give that caveat that you don't have to be able to do this for your entire garden at once. I think starting with that bubble design can be helpful, and then you pick one at a time to really focus in on. So design could be an entire semester-long course, but if you want to dive more into it, I really recommend this book, Integrated Landscaping, Following Nature's Lead. It's from the University of New Hampshire Press, and it is this whole concept of design, but through this ecological lens, and because it's New Hampshire, a lot of the information is relevant to our climate, so they have really good plant lists in there. They have some like sample designs of different sizes for different conditions, so I really like that book. Okay, so how are we adding this ecological perspective to garden design? I think an important thing is to add the elements of habitat, so food, places to reproduce, water, and shelter. So the first one, food and places to reproduce. When I'm thinking about designing, I'm thinking about natives. So I'm guessing most of you are familiar with Doug Ptolemy. And if you're not, I highly recommend looking up his lectures. He's really engaging. He's been the big proponent of talking about the importance of native plants to the rest of our ecosystem. So because our insects have co-evolved alongside these native plants, that's what they need to eat and more importantly to reproduce. And as we know, plants get their energy from the sun, insects eat them, birds eat the insects, so on. So that's kind of the whole basis of our food web, requires insects to have something to eat. And if you want birds, they have to have insects to eat. I'm also thinking about season-long blooms. So for our pollinators, we want to make sure they have something early in the spring, through the middle of the summer, and late. When you're designing, the middle of the season is really easy. Most of the stuff we're going to get is going to be middle, so I recommend start with first a few early. So blue-eyed grass, this is one that I really like. This blue-eyed grass and columbine, I think, look really good together. Those are two nice early ones. So find yourself a few early ones, and ideally you want multiple, because you want to have multiple plants in each niche. So if in 1 year your blue-eyed grass just does terribly, they have something else. Then skip to fall and identify a few things, and then the summer will fill itself in. And the last thing I'm thinking about for food and places to reproduce is winter food sources. So this could be shrubs with berries, things like winterberry, mash trees, so a tree that produces a lot of acorns or something like that. And the bonus is that this is providing for the wildlife, but it's also adding to your design because it's adding winter interests. So things like sumac that keep color through the winter, that's a robin. I had a flock of like 20 robins show up a few weeks ago to just eat my sumac. So you get kind of the benefit of something for the wildlife and something for you to look at. Same with the season-long blooms. When we think about garden design, we think about having something blooming all the time. So if you're designing for the pollinators to have pollen all season, you're also going to have flowers for you to look at. The next habitat element I'm going to mention, water. Also crucial for wildlife. If you're lucky enough to live next to a body of water, this is already taken care of for you. But if not, there's a range of things you can add from simple to really expensive. So on the simple end, bee cups or bird baths. I also just have a bowl of water with some like aquarium rocks in it so that bees could land on those to drink water. If you have a bird bath, make sure you're dumping it out no less than every 5 days to interrupt the mosquito breeding cycle. And if you want to get really fancy, fountains and ponds are amazing. A lot of animals like the moving water. But I would wait, give yourself a year and live in the landscape before you make a decision where you'd want one of those. But you also don't have to. Like I said, bird bath is a pretty easy way to provide that. And the last habitat element shelter we'll get into in the maintenance phase.
Excuse me.
Yes.
On the one back there, is that a bee cup? What is laying in the pathway?
That's just a bowl of water. Good question about a bee cup. A bee cup is actually, they're these tiny little ceramic cups that are specifically designed to hold like a teaspoon of water that bees can drink out of. This bird bath is not great for pollinators because there's really nothing for them to land on. So when we're thinking about insects, we're thinking more about a bowl full of rocks, a little bee cup, even a butterfly puddling area. Some butterflies really like mud. So that's a good question.
You can have a bowl and just put rocks in the bottom. The bees need a place to land and then come down to the water's edge, essentially, to take in water. So if you put, 2 or 3 rocks in the middle of some sort of a shallow bowl, then they can land on the rocks and get out the water.
Yeah, for everyone on Zoom, there was a recommendation for just getting a bowl, filling it with rocks, and keeping those partially above the water so bees can land and drink. So I also talked about reducing inputs, and you can build this into your design. And I'm going to start with probably the most controversial aspect, which is lawn. Have you guys heard of the people talking about the kill your lawn movement? And this is touchy, and I think it's because it's not right for everybody. So the reason they are talking about this, traditional lawn involves a lot of inputs. Water, fertilizer, potentially herbicides or pesticides. In return, it does not offer a ton of ecosystem benefits. It's not really producing nectar, pollen, or a lot of habitat, and it's generally not a native species. Does this mean that you should have no lawn in your design? No. You absolutely, like I said, if you want to play soccer, you should have a lawn for that. If you want to have a spot for your dinner table outside, have lawn for that. But I think a mindset shift can be thinking of lawn as area rugs, not wall-to-wall carpet. So keeping the lawn you need, and anything you don't need, save yourself the time mowing and turn it into a perennial bed. There are also lawn alternatives you can consider. This is Pennsylvania sedge. It's a native sedge. It actually takes shade well. Not something if you have a ton of heavy foot traffic, but if you just have an area you want to keep open, it also doesn't need mowing. It gets, this tall and just stays that way. So this is at Garden in the Woods. It's I think really cool looking. Another one, creeping juniper. Again, if you have a space you just want to keep open for a view, but you don't plan to spend time, that's another option. And there are things you can interseed into your lawn. So you can also add clovers or some other flowering species into your lawn. But of course, if you're doing that, you would no longer be applying herbicides that kill broadleaf weeds. Another way to reduce inputs is to select natives. As I said, they're better adapted to our conditions, so you're not going to be needing to add as much to your soil, and if they're planted in the right place, you probably won't need to provide a lot of supplemental water either after the establishment year. So just a few ones. I already mentioned red columbine is one I love for early summer color. Mountain mint is going to attract a ton of pollinators. Cardinal flower is a great option for wet spots. But there's a million native plants out there. Also, some other traditional design notions that we might want to challenge is plant spacing. So when I think about traditional design, it's fairly static, and you're kind of designing clumps of different species, expecting them to ideally stay in that place. Maybe you have a few trees and shrubs. And then in practice, a lot of times when we plant, we read the label and it says, this needs 24 to 36 inches. So we plop it in, and then there's about 3 feet of mulch before the next plant. And we're hoping it's going to fill in. And maybe it does, but in the meantime, we're having to put down a lot of mulch. And a lot of times people will talk about well, I put something in and now it's flopping over. if you think about the way things grow in nature, that's not really how things grow. If you think about a meadow, things are growing all together, and they're not only close together, but there's different levels. So there's often flowering plants and grasses mixed together and ground covers. And you don't see a lot of things flopping over because they support each other, and also root competition keeps things smaller so they don't get too big and flop over. So in some ecological garden design practices, we see people planting much closer together, like everything on an 8 to 12 inch basis, no matter what it says, putting all your plugs in 8 to 12 inches apart. And approach is also matrix planting. So this goes even further. This is a landscape design approach that mimics natural ecosystems by closely planting and layering compatible perennials and grasses to cover the soil. By doing that, you're providing more ecosystem services, you're limiting the need for wood mulch or aggressive weeding. So this picture is not quite a great example. There's not enough grass in there to be matrix planting. And the amount of grass you can vary, but basically it's a planting method where you're picking complementary plants and kind of planting a lot of them pretty close together to try to mimic nature, which is kind of an ongoing theme of ecological planting, is we're trying to more closely mimic nature with the way we plant and maintain our gardens. But there are some things I think are important to keep from traditional garden design. Doing a detailed design and keeping a map of what you plant is always really important. Things like formal edging can be really important to add what we call a cue to care. So with some of these more natural designs, they can move into looking messy, or there's the potential that someone could assume that we've just let our lawn grow up and not actually mowed it. So a cue to care is something that shows people that this actually is a cared for, intentional design. So simply adding some edging or paths. I saw a webinar and the guy was talking about how sort of a lawn meadow with just some fence looked like an unmowed lawn, but the minute you just mowed a path around it, it started to look very intentional. Another thing to keep from traditional design is the idea of thinking in terms of rooms for your garden. So just like we design a house with different rooms for different purposes, we can do the same for our garden. So this is the part of my garden I do my dining in. This is the part that has my compost and maybe is a little more hidden. And that can include creating walls to these rooms, fences, tall plants. I think what's important about that is adding a sense of mystery, which is actually like a key element of garden design. So picture you're somewhere and there's a path that leads off and you can't see where it goes, and you want to follow it. That's something, as opposed to like a big landscape where you can just see the whole thing at once. Adding mystery can be really helpful. Also, traditional design teaches us that straight edge beds are more formal, curved beds are more natural. So I think in an ecological design, those curved beds can look nice and mimic nature. This is a trick you guys probably already know, but I really like to use garden hoses to lay out my curved beds. They have like just the right amount of flexibility. So I'll lay out a garden hose where I think a new bed's gonna go, look at it from 12 different angles, adjust it, add flags, but I'm still not gonna put in any permanent edging. I like to live with it for a while, so I tend to just do like a cut shovel edge and wait a while before, because I have created it and then I've gone back and changed the edge a little bit 6 months later. So final step of plant design is plant selection. You're going to start with your existing plants and make some decisions. What stays and what goes. So we already talked about the invasives. You're going to identify those and start removing them. It may take time, that's okay, but it's definitely a project to start on. You are going to identify your natives. You don't necessarily have to keep every native. There are what we call aggressive natives. These are different from invasives. Invasives by definition are not native, but there are aggressive natives. These are the things that, you know, if a tree falls in the woods, they're gonna fill in first. I think of like Virginia creeper, common milkweed in situations can be really aggressive. They may not be right for your yard. So if you had a tiny garden and you had common milkweed, even though it's native, that might not be right for that garden. So I'm giving you permission to remove natives if they're not a good fit. But I will make a plug for, if you have a weedy looking native and your first instinct is to get rid of it, just give it a chance, think about it. I think sumac is something that people just see on the roadside. I've heard people call sumac invasive because they assume because it's weedy, that's invasive. It's not, it's a native. And I think it's beautiful and architectural. It has these seed heads that go from pink to red, and the wildlife love it, as I said. It usually makes it through most of the winter, and then sometime around this time of year, I have flocks of things show up and enjoy it. So I think maybe give some weedy perennials a chance, but totally okay to remove something if it's too aggressive for your conditions. And the last thing you're going to consider, what are you going to do with your existing non-natives? Again, you don't have to remove everything that's non-native. If I had a really nice specimen tree, I would probably leave it no matter what, even if it wasn't native. Ecological design does not require that you plant 100% natives. I think one of the things is to consider moving to landscaping includes no natives, so not a ton of resources for wildlife. So even if you could go from 0 to 30% natives, or maybe then you shoot for 70% natives. But I have things in my garden that are not native because they're things I just really like. But for your existing non-natives, I would say use the Marie Kondo method. If it doesn't bring you joy, get rid of it. I had an endless summer hydrangea, which they call endless bummer. It has every single year died back to the ground, and so it went to a friend's house. She lives in a little bit warmer part of Maine. See if it lives for her, but I wasn't going to hold on to it. So in the process of selecting new plants, we have to learn about them. So how many of you have a plant wish list? I've got a couple of you more. But in order to take that wish list, from a wish list to design, we have to have information so we know if it's appropriate for our garden and what part of our garden. I am a spreadsheet person, so that's how I organize my information. And these are some of the resources I use. So again, when we're thinking about right plant, right place, we're thinking about how much sun does it need, how much moisture, what kind of soil does it like, how tall does it get, when does it bloom. When we're thinking about season-long blooms, it can help to write that down. Color flowers for design. How well does it play with others? So when you're reading about it, if you're seeing words like aggressive, that's a piece of information that would be helpful. So Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder is an amazing resource. Similarly, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. If you want to check the native status of something, either the USDA Plants Database or the Native Plant Trust Go Botany. I really like Go Botany because it has a cool little map on every single plant page. And if it's green for Maine, then you know it's native for Maine. It has down to county level. I'm not worrying about that. If it's native somewhere in Maine, I'm counting it as native for my garden. And lastly, seed catalogs and their websites can have a ton of information. It's not an endorsement, but if you want some free information, Prairie Moon Nursery has a lot of natives and it has propagation info, a lot of this information. So those are some of the resources I'm using as I fill out my spreadsheet. Some final thoughts on the design phase. Design is place specific. I already talked about that. So we're not just thinking about the right plant for your location and its unique requirements. We're also thinking about how our garden's fitting into the broader ecosystem. And the design is dynamic in ecological design. So we're letting plants do what they naturally do. There may be some amount of succession. Plants may move around. You may get more of one plant as it spreads, less of another. More so in traditional design, we're looking to mimic nature. And the way we do that is we design in layers and we're adding complexity, just constantly adding complexity and adding as much diversity as we can. And we can design for specific animals. So you can plant as an invitation for animals. So if you want to see hummingbirds in your garden, plant jewelweed and plant some red flowers. If you want specific butterflies, you can plant their host plants. And you'll be surprised how quickly they'll show up. Okay, we've done our design, and now we have to actually start putting in the garden. And there are ecological aspects to how we can do this too. So starting with establishing new beds. I think in a lot of situations we're killing existing sod to do this. I have done this by putting down plastic for a season. I've dug and removed the sod by hand. I've tried cardboard. They all, cardboard that you just put over the sod and then mulch. They all work. I think it just depends on how fast you need to be able to get into plant. So the further ahead you start, the easier it is. So if you start tarping it a year ahead of time, by the time you need to plant, it's gonna be very easy. But if you, like in this situation, have plants that need to go in the ground immediately and you haven't even started, you're probably gonna be doing more work and maybe digging some sod out by hand. So they all those methods work. When you get to prepping the soil, remember we're not heavily amending. So we're probably not putting in any lime, no fertilizer. If you're in a situation where your native soil has been heavily altered, say it's new construction, they scraped off all the topsoil, it might be appropriate to amend with some compost, but in general, we're really not adding much if we're planting natives. I'm not going to talk too much about sourcing plants because I'm guessing all of you in here are experts at plant shopping already. And also native plants are getting much easier to find at nurseries, local plant sales. There are native specific plant sales in Maine now. But I do want to talk about starting your own from seed. I think this is a really important aspect of accessibility. If you're starting a big garden and you're buying all 1 gallon plants, it's going to get really expensive really fast. But I think this can be accessible to pretty much anyone if you do it really cheap. So starting from seed can be as simple as you want it. You can just winter seed, where you throw some seeds in a pot, you put it out to winter stratify and hope in the spring you get some. I use the things mushrooms come in, little plastic trays. I just poke holes in them, so you can use free trays to do this. You can obtain your seeds pretty inexpensively by trading with friends or wild collecting, as long as you follow best practices for wild collecting. So if you're going to do that, read a little bit more about that. And the reason to consider this, besides being affordable, if you're going to be planting in masses or drifts, which looks more intentional for large spaces, you're going to need potentially a lot of each plant, which again could get really expensive. Also, growing from seeds is going to give you more genetic diversity. So a lot of our nursery grown plants, if they're clones, genetically may be all really the same. But if you grow from seed, you're getting, each plant is genetically different, and this makes them more resilient. So in a year where it's really dry, some of those are probably going to be a little better adapted. And also you're going to get a wider selection. It's getting better what you can buy in terms of native plants that are started, but from seed, there's a huge amount that I mentioned Prairie Moon Nursery. They have the number of sedges alone that they sell in seed. I think it's like crazy, like 30 plus sedges you can grow from seed. So growing from seeds will also give you more options. So like I said, it can be really simple. Pots that you put out to overwinter. There's great information online about how to do that. Wild Seed Project is like the go-to resource. Or like me, where I can't do anything simple or small, you can get crazy. So I got heating mats, lights, 20-row cedars, and then once... Yeah. This is my therapy. Once those 20-row cedars filled up, I would move them up to larger and larger trays. And this is because I was filling in a pretty big area. Was that? Yeah, got it. It was like a 45 by 10 foot garden to begin with. And you can see I ended up with thousands of plants that way. And I would never have been able to afford to buy all those plants. So what does this look like in practice? This is a spot I put in a bed. The turf looks good here. It really wasn't. It was pretty poor turf. So the first spring, we dug all the turf out. I had put some leaves there over the winter to start killing some of it. Dug out the turf, edged it. I put down mulch on the whole thing first because I was planting in little plugs, so it was actually much easier to plant into mulch than to have to mulch around plugs, if that makes sense. And I planted, I would say about 6 plants, maybe were actual plants I bought. The rest was all grown from seed starting that winter before. So again, this is then spring year 2. So by the end of year 1, those plugs still looked like basically nothing. And I was like, ugh, even though I planted them really close. It's like, I don't know what this is going to look like much next year. So you can see in spring, like they're starting to turn into little plants, but still a little sparse. But By June, they're starting to fill in. I've got a little bit of color from some allium bulbs I put in. But by August of that second year, stuff I'd grown from seed had filled in. And part of that was because I picked things, some of the things I picked were things that flower in that first year and grow pretty fast. There are some grasses and other things that grow in much slower mixed in there. So as a reminder, that's basically a year before. That's what that looked like. So just want to give an example of what growing from seed can get you. I think people think they want instant gratification, so they buy big perennials, but I don't really think you have to wait that much longer when you grow from seed. What about meadows? I think a lot of people who are interested in native gardening ask about meadows. So the traditional kind of philosophy of how you do a meadow, if you're planting into existing turf or a place with invasives, is that you have to take it down to nothing. You have to kill it either with a tarp or herbicides or by rototilling. That's a lot of work. And a lot of people ask me, they're like, can I just go throw like a handful of seeds out and get a meadow? Probably not going to get the result you want, but there are other approaches. So I actually started this first. I had another patch of pretty bad grass, and I was like, what if I just start planting stuff in the grass and let it grow? Total experiment. And you can see the grass grew up, but I also planted some stuff in there. So you can see there's some like broadleaves in there. And then that's later in the season, the Rudbeckia did really well. Other things I planted totally disappeared, never made it. But I just watched a webinar actually about another woman whose dad is a fairly well-known designer. And she also did it, a native meadow planted into turf. But she dethatched multiple times. She applied sulfur multiple times. Strategic mowing, so it's still a ton of work. The advantage for her, though, was that it never looked totally brown, so she got to keep the green turf. So you can do it, but I guess the point is for a true meadow, it's never going to be totally labor-free. In Maine, the natural state of most of Maine is forest. So in Maine, most meadows are going to successionally move into forest, so you're at least always going to have to fight back the trees. I would say if you have a small area and you really just want the meadow aesthetic, consider like that matrix planting approach of planting a lot of things really densely with a lot of grass. I think you could get the same thing, but if you're starting from plugs, you're gonna have to do a lot less fighting of weeds. Okay, maintenance. I've got 10 minutes left, and this is our final kind of big area we're gonna talk about. So I'm gonna start with a term I made up and I'm trying to sell, which is the idea of carbon hoarding as maintenance. So going back to basics of the carbon cycle, carbon gets stored in our soil, in our biomass, trees, plants, and the more carbon that's stored in our soil and in plant biomass, the less is in the atmosphere as CO2, a greenhouse gas. So that is a way we can mitigate climate change. But it's also a way to adapt to climate change because the carbon in our soil, that's the primary component of organic matter, and organic matter helps our soils retain moisture, also drain better, retain nutrients, so it can also make our soils more climate resilient. So it's both an adaptation and a mitigation. So how are we gonna hoard this carbon? The first thing is really easy. It's leaving the leaves. I'm sure you guys have all heard the Leave the Leaves movement. For a more in-depth discussion, I did just write an article for Maine Home Garden News in the October issue, where I go into more of the like nuance of when it's appropriate, when it might not work. But basically the idea is we're mimicking nature. So in the forest, leaves fall onto the ground and nobody rakes them up. They break down, they provide habitat for insects, they provide food for the soil microbes, and they add that carbon and the nutrient back to the soil right under the plant they fell from. So a good reminder for me of this is I was cleaning up some leaves around my door and I kept finding all these woolly bears. And it was like a reminder that like that was their winter home. They had gotten all cozy in those leaves to overwinter and I was disturbing them. So of course I felt very guilty and gently relocated all of them. But when you're sending leaves to the landfill in bags, you're also sending some of your pollinators, some of your overwintering insects. So I like this quote. It says, if you don't rake your leaves, they turn into soil, right? They don't break into your house and drink all the wine or anything. It may not be right for your entire property. If you have a tree with a fungal issue, probably don't want to keep those leaves. If you have a major tick issue, you may not want to keep leaves everywhere. And if you have a lot of leaves, you probably don't want to keep them on your lawn because it can suffocate your lawn. But you can use a mower and mulch those right into your lawn. You're not getting the pollinator habitat benefit, but you're still getting the carbon benefit. I think the easiest way to start leaving the leaves is to leave all the ones that fall in your perennial gardens and maybe even add some more. So you can relocate the ones from your lawn onto your perennial gardens, and it's going to save you on mulch. The next way you can hoard carbon is skip the fall cleanup. This already came up at the beginning, the pre-talk chat. So the reason we're doing this is there are lots of pollinators that overwinter in the stems. That's a lot of little bees make their homes in there. Also, they're beautiful. I talked about the designer, where he talks a lot about the beauty of different stems. They're also winter food for our birds. So if you can, if it works for you, if you can leave these through the next spring until the nights consistently are 50 degrees, that's the best guesstimate of when a lot of insects have emerged. And then consider the chop and drop method. So rather than getting rid of them completely, if you chop everything into about 6-inch pieces and just let it fall, you're just letting that, that's free mulch. The seeds, if you're okay with the seeds going into the seed bank, that's potentially more plants for you. So all of this, you're adding leaves, you're adding stems. It could get a little messy looking. So you could consider the garden mullet. So this is neat in the front, messy in the back. So if you have a deep bed, maybe throw your leaves and throw your chop and drop debris in the back of the bed. But if you still want to look neat, you could just mulch the front. That's, again, what we call cue to care. You also can throw mulch over leaves. So you could throw the leaves in and then throw a little bit of woodbuck mulch if you wanted it to look neater. So there are some compromises you can make to still get a neater garden aesthetic, but add all this carbon. I'm going to talk now about some advanced carbon hoarding techniques. This is called a dead hedge. It's a fence hedge-like structure for all your dead debris. So rather than piling your sticks at the bottom of the driveway for the town to come pick up, you're putting 2 rows of uprights in the ground and then just laying sticks, laying leaves, everything in between. If you're concerned about fire, keep this outside like the direct fire envelope of your home because it is flammable. But it's all those sticks and stuff are eventually going to break down and it's going to return that carbon to your soil. It's also amazing wildlife habitat. Chipmunks love it. I've seen birds doing courtship displays on mine. And I also think it looks really cool. And when we talked about designing rooms, this is a way you can kind of add visual boundaries to your garden. That's the one I built in 2 different seasons. And building it's honestly my favorite garden activity. I call it stick time. I just turn off my brain and I just collect sticks and I just arrange them. And funny story, we had this picture on our statewide social media. It ended up in a local newspaper. They put it on Pinterest, and from there, it started popping up on Facebook. So my own picture was popping up on my Facebook feed with other people posting it, which was a weird experience, but honestly, I'm happy that they're promoting this concept. Another kind of advanced carbon hoarding is snag trees and down logs, and considering keeping these. So a snag tree is anything bigger than 3 inches in diameter that's dead or dying that you keep upright. And these are, wildlife use these for nesting, for foraging, for courtship displays, picture woodpeckers looking for food in them. That, they can be kind of cool looking, like that one. This one's across from my house. And I've seen all kinds of birds, including like turkey vultures, hawks, woodpeckers. Be, practical about this. Don't leave a snag tree somewhere it's going to fall and hurt somebody. But if you have a little bit more space, consider leaving this. I think our natural instinct is to clean up everything that's dead and get it out of the way. But in nature, trees do just die, and they're a really important element of habitat. And you can also do the same with logs that are on the ground, especially if you want like salamanders and some more amphibians. They really appreciate dead logs. So leaving some dead stuff. Also going to talk a little bit about no mow May. Who's heard of no mow May? Yeah. This one is controversial, and the reason it's controversial is a well-maintained lawn probably doesn't have much that's going to flower in it because a lot of people are using herbicides. Probably doesn't have a lot of stuff native in it, and May, it's like May work for one part of the country. That's not necessarily the right time for us. But I will say I tried in my yard. I just waited as long as I could to mow. I did have quite a bit of stuff flowering pop up. You can see dandelions. I think I had dead nettles. I had a lot of violets. And I saw bees foraging. And so I left it as long as I could. And even once I started mowing, I would mow around the patches of violets. So I guess bottom line, I think no mow May is probably overhyped in terms of how impactful it is. Planting spring natives would be a lot more impactful than just not mowing your lawn, but I also don't think it hurts, and it saves some fuel to not mow. Pest and disease control is the last piece of maintenance I'm going to talk about. And I talked about the food web, that native plants get eaten by native insects. So if nothing is eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. So I invite you to sort of like reconsider your instincts about how perfect your plants have to look. I think we go to the garden center, we pick a perfect looking plant, we put it in our garden, we hope it's going to stay perfect. But if we want native insects, they're going to eat our plants. So a black swallowtail has pretty much demolished the top of, I think this was Golden Alexander. And this is American lady butterfly on my Pearly Everlasting. It looks, the Pearly Everlasting looked terrible. It was, every leaf was gone, it was brown and shriveled. But the reward I got was American lady butterflies later in the season. So if you're inviting plants as or if you're planting things as an invitation for wildlife, you have to accept that they might get nibbled on a little bit. If that level of nibbling is endangering the plant living, you may have to take action and do some pest and disease control at some point, especially if it's a non-native insect, that's the issue. But I would say just try to go for the least toxic options first, start with those, and always follow label directions. Okay, last thing I'm very quickly going to show you is some successes and some lessons learned in my last minute and a half. And the reason I measure my successes is I talked to you about all my goals, and one of those was really creating wildlife habitat. So for me, it's really rewarding to check if I'm actually successfully doing that. So I take a lot of photos and I upload them to iNaturalist. And it's interesting when you actually start tracking how much more you realize you're seeing. So I had over a dozen butterfly species. I've had over 33 species of birds, including 6 different woodpeckers, which I never would have guessed until I started counting. That's a flock of turkeys that regularly move through and enjoy my bird feeder. And I get a lot of amphibians and mammals. I've had 4 species of frogs, including this gray tree frog. I have woodchucks, including this woodchuck enjoying one of my stag trees. I've had foxes, red squirrels, gray squirrels, raccoons, so woodchucks, skunks, possums, deer, bats, and even a fisher cat that came through. And this is all in fairly urban Lewiston, urban for Maine. And so I guess one thing I want to say about wildlife is you can't really pick and choose. So there's woodchucks. Lessons learned. Research your plants, or you're going to end up with a 7-foot tall plant at the front of your bed. Happened to me. If you want grasses as part of a matrix planting or part of your design, and you're starting from seed, in my experience, they grow much slower. So if I could go back and splurge on one thing, it probably would have been a tray of grasses that someone else had started for me. Allow for edits, don't put in that edge at the beginning, allow yourself to kind of change your mind. Don't start the seeds or order the plants if you don't have a spot ready to plant. I'm sure all of you have made that mistake, and I continue to make it every year where I get excited and order plants, like my bare root order that's coming this spring, and I don't know where they're going yet. And again, if you invite wildlife, you can't pick and choose who shows up. So just be ready to either tolerate some damage or make some adjustments. I have deer fence around the part of my garden I really don't want them to get to, and the rest of my yard is, for them to get. So I hope the takeaway you get is that you can incorporate the ecological approach to any aspect, all the way from design through maintenance, and you can still get the utility, enjoyment, and beauty out of your garden while providing benefits for your local ecosystem. This is feedback rather than me making you guys fill out a survey. This is much less painful. So by show of hands, and be honest, did you learn something today? And will you do something different as a result of what you learned today? Cool, I appreciate that. And last, I have to plug some events. Extension Spring Gardening Webinar Series, Gardening for the Future, is looking at more resilient gardens. So next week, if you are not sick of hearing me talk, I'll be speaking along with Sean Burkle, our state climatologist, who is like, if you're into weather, he's the guy, about what a change in climate in Maine looks like and some gardening. You'll see some familiar things. The next week, we have Hannah Mullally from Fish and Wildlife talking about pollinators. She's a really good speaker. Then we have Becoming a Resilient Vegetable Gardener, talking about some techniques to adapt your vegetable garden. And last, perennials for the resilient gardening. So thinking about plant selection in light of changing climate in Maine. And anytime, we also have a pollinator-friendly gardening course and certification and webinars on demand. So we have lots of back catalog of webinars. So if you go to if you just Google Maine Extension Garden and Yard page, all the stuff is up on that page. And that is it. Oh, I'll go back so in case people want to.
It's like Maine Extension Garden.
The Garden and Yard page has all of our stuff. Yep. Follow our Facebook. The stuff gets posted there.
Those are all Zoom meetings, right?
Yep. Though these are all virtual options. Yep, that are available statewide.
Yes.
And with that, any questions? From the, check the Zoom too.
Yeah, and folks in the Zoom, if you type questions into the chat, we will ask Rebecca for you.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
what's the best way to get rid of bittersweet? I'm sure you've answered this 100 times.
Yeah. So I will say the state has great pages with control info for each invasive plant. Bittersweet specifically, you can rip it out. If it's small enough, you can pull it out by hand. It has that really distinct orange root. You're just gonna have to watch her resprouting if you don't get every root piece. I will also say that I am an advocate for using herbicide very selectively for invasives. There are ways to apply herbicides that are less likely to impact non-target species. So you can do painted stems. So I've done that. When I had bittersweet vines that were like this big around, I was not gonna be able to pull those out. So in the fall is the time where plants are taking nutrients down to their roots. So I would get a really concentrated glyphosate herbicide and paint it on. I'd cut that, paint it on, the plant takes it down to its roots along with its thing and kills the roots. So for small bittersweet, I pull it out. Big, I would probably do a painted stem herbicide treatment. And there are some other ways to apply. There's other ways to apply herbicide, like you can wipe it on, things that avoid having to like spray and potentially hit other stuff.
Someone in the chat had asked why burning bush is bad.
Great question. Burning bush is also called winged euonymus. Beautiful fall color. I see tons of it in Maine. It is invasive. It's on our do not sell list. So it's a non-native, and it is, to make it onto the do not sell list, it not only is non-native, but it has to be aggressive enough that it's going to displace other native species and spread. So it unfortunately does. Beautiful, but if you want fall color, there's tons of natives that provide beautiful fall color. Blueberries, a lot of our viburnums turn beautiful colors in the fall. So if you ever are emotionally ready to part with your burning bush, I would say there are some great alternatives.
It's hard checking it out after the video. I'd like to just share a lesson I learned from something that you brought up. I not last fall, the fall before, I was going to do a new flower garden. So during the fall, I got a bunch of cardboard and put it down with staples, garden staples. Here's a mistake I made that I'll never make again. It looked great. I put them side by side, the cardboard pieces. Well, when the snow left and the spring came, there were so many weeds coming up.
Yeah.
So what I've learned is that take your cardboard
Do some
and
overlap. Yeah. Cool. You can always come chat afterwards. My email's up there. You can also just Google my name and UMaine Extension and you'll find me. Thank you guys.
I'll just make a plug for the garden and take a piece out of PBS's playbook and say that this is possible thanks to viewers like you. So if you like this programming and you want to see more of that, consider making a donation to the garden. We have donation cans on that bureau and then in the snack room. And then folks online, you can make a donation on our website at McLaughlingarden.org.
And come back for the plant sale in the spring.
And come back for the plant sale. Yes, Mother's Day weekend. Get your native plants. All right. Thank you, everyone.